regular basis so that we can evolve, grow, and be encouraging and upbuilding, not just to ourselves, but to each other, and so it is. Okay, so again, we are still on the 4 agreements, so we are on agreement 3, and tonight's lesson will be shared with us from Reverend Vince, and he is going to be talking about do not make assumptions. Okay? Reverend Vince, it's all you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, keep it brief tonight, don't make assumptions, thank you.
I thought it was going to be longer.
So it's interesting that this is something that we all do, obviously. I know that I do it. And assumptions are something that it's really a part of who we are in a sense, but it's also something that we need to step back and look at. It really is something that needs to be almost controlled in a sense. And it really leads to the other agreements, because when we make assumptions, we generally have some type of conversation linked to that assumption, and that really links to the first agreement, is making your words impeccable. And when we're talking about assumptions of maybe worry or things that haven't even happened yet, that's really not necessarily a good use of our own words. And then about making it personal, we tend to make assumptions pretty personal. So those 2 agreements actually add to this last one. So I think that it's, when we make assumptions, we're really trying to basically predict the future, right? I don't know about you, but how many of you are really good at accurately depicting or predicting the future? I know that I'm not very good. So,
I have my moments.
Yeah. So I mean, it's interesting because we can spend so much time on something and energy that is never going to happen. So we tend to really waste our energy. Not only that, we also tend to put limits on the reality that we can create for ourselves. We have a tendency to have negative assumptions very often. So by doing that, we're more likely to have a negative outcome. So it goes hand in hand. Now, most of the assumption-based thoughts really come from your ego. And the ego is a funny thing, because even though in the book, The Power of Now, it really puts down the ego very much, and it needs to be controlled, but the ego is also necessary because it's a part of your survival mechanism, and also is a driver for you in your life. Without ego, you'd be kind of like a boneless chicken. So you really need to use the ego as an instrument and not have the ego use you. So that's what happens, is that we let the ego go wild and control us instead of our minds controlling the ego. And then we get into trouble that way. So it's hard to, let's just go back to the survival aspect of the ego. Since it's a part of our makeup, since we're not running away from bears and lions anymore, our enemies become our boss, might be our teacher, maybe someone in our family, might be my mother-in-law. I can say that because I don't have a mother-in-law. So, but these things happen, that we create situations that we have to be in defense mode. And a lot of it has really no basis in reality. Or we're creating the situation and becoming our own drama queens. So it's interesting that I'm speaking about this tonight, because I'm actually going through a situation at work. And it's been prolonged on and on, going on and on. I'm waiting for a word about what they're going to either offer me or with a position or not. So of course, I kind of turned it all upside down, and it went from something very positive, and then I made it really negative, and it was interesting this morning, because I was supposed to have a meeting on it today, which actually got delayed, but I'm there in bed, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and I'm, flopping around like a fish on the deck, and I'm thinking about this whole scenario, and I'm making up this whole thing in my mind, about what I'm gonna do, and how I'm gonna be the victim, and they're gonna, possibly come after me, and everything else, and then I'm gonna be the tough guy, I'm gonna resign, and this whole ridiculous thing. So, what was interesting about it was that I kind of almost exhausted myself thinking about it a little bit. And then all of a sudden, my inner self just said, power. And then I said, you know what? Whether I get what was going to be offered to me or not, I still have the ability to put myself in a position to kind of carve out what I want, even if they're not really ready to offer that to me. I can negotiate that. So out of the chaos, finally my inner self came through with a word that kind of snapped me out of it, and then gave me the insight into how to approach it. So I was able to be much more positive today compared to the way I was this morning. Let's put it that way, in bed. So we have a tendency to look at situations and make assumptions. The other way we also make assumptions is that we assume that people understand what we're thinking and what we want and what our reality is. And in the 4 agreements, one of the things that emphasizes is that everyone's really living their own dream, in their own reality. So even in this room, everyone's perception of this room and this reality is different, than everyone else's. So you can't make the assumption that someone's going to understand you, and when they don't understand you, you get upset because you're offended, because you feel disrespected. It's just that you're expecting them to really understand you, and you really only have to understand yourself. That's really what matters. So assumptions are, funny things. I mean, it's hard to sit and, living in the now is great, but in reality, it's hard to just sit and live in the now. I mean, you do have aspirations for the future, and yes, you can have an appreciation for the now, and you should, and live in it as much as possible, but it doesn't mean that you don't have a projection either. So I think that you can have both, but it's really when the ego gets involved that the ego wants to be the hero, basically. It wants to say, it creates a problem that it says, I created the problem and I'm the savior. I'm going to be the one that solves it for you. So it creates the problem, the conflict, and then it says, oh, you can only rely on me because I'm the only one who understands you. So it creates this false narrative constantly. And so we have to push back on the ego and put it back basically in its place. And those assumptions really play a huge role with ego. And we know that it's a good check and balance. If you're in assumption land all the time, you know that you're not controlling your ego's controlling you. So it's not a bad place to view things. And at that point, I think you just have to it's great to just be quiet and still and realize that the truth is, in most of the vast majority of these situations, you're really not under any threat. But it's a false threat that you're being perceived by the ego. So it's important to try to relax and think about it. Again, going back to the survival mechanism, your mother-in-law most likely isn't going to kill you, most likely, or really cause any harm to torture. But we almost feel it in our minds, in our own feelings, that it's actually some kind of real threat. Just like, it could be in the office of the family or someone, or it can be just a conversation or two people with two different opinions, it's not a threat to you that they don't agree with you. You know, it just isn't, and you really don't have to win the conversation because there's really nothing to win. But it's perceived as threatening. So assumptions tend to lead us into this false world, and we can get so wrapped up in the energy that we expend on them. It also makes us much more sensitive for when things actually do happen in reality. Sometimes we have a tendency to overreact because we've been in assumption land for too long, and we become a little hypersensitive. So we have a tendency to overreact. And I think that's, you know, reaction, I think, is an important part of it. It's really not about, it's about sometimes not reacting right away, just taking your time. And that even goes back to the agreement of taking things personally. If we can go and take some time to really think about it and not react right away and get in that into that mode, that protection mode, then we can really find that if we give it a little time, we'll see more of the truth of what's happening, and things settle down. So assumptions are something that we all do, but I think it's a great measure of who's in control, your ego or yourself. So I think that's primarily the most important thing about assumption, and about really focusing on what's happening around you in the real world. You know, we have to get out of the drama. I think we have enough drama in our lives right now. We live in a very a time of tremendous input and a lot of negative input. You know, so I think we have to be careful of how much negative input we allow in our lives, because again, that makes us sensitive to our own issues, and our own perceptions of other people and situations. So I think, you know, it's hard to, if you go back 200 years and you were like working the farm, you know, yeah, you definitely had a hard life, a hard physical life and everything, but mentally it was very, very different. You know, you didn't have these constant threats in general. You didn't have this input in you, this noise that's constantly coming in you. So I think we have to find a way to clear, and that could be through meditation, that could be through prayer, that could be through, you know, different things, or even a ceremony. But I think with all the input today, that tends to be on the negative side, because people love bad news, and they're attracted to it. We need a way to kind of just chill out, maybe every morning, maybe every evening. I try to, like at work, I'll walk about 25 minutes during lunch, just to kind of get out of the office and just, you know, it's kind of a meditative walk for me. That kind of puts things in perspective for me. So I think we need to practice more clearing on a regular basis, because we're surrounded by a lot of noise, which then it makes us, you know, hypersensitive. And when we get into that mode, we tend to make more assumptions, because it's like it's a cycle, and sometimes we have to get off the merry-go-round, so to speak. You know? But I think, you know, if you look at all the agreements, I think they do build on each other. I think it's very simple, but what makes it powerful is because it's simple. You know, if it was, we tend to want to complicate things a lot, you know, but if it's complicated, you really can't follow it. It's really hard. So I think the simplicity of the agreements lends itself to being able to actually follow and pursue them. You know? And I think that's why they're powerful. I think that's what I have on the assumptions there today. So, thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Vince. We really appreciate that. I know that I have a real quick story to tell in relationship to assumptions. I think that quite often we're lazy with a capital L, in that it's much easier to guess what somebody's thinking than ask somebody what they're thinking. And so we will just guess what they're thinking and make an assumption rather than go to them and open ourselves up for the possibility of a different answer. But there's this really cool story that I wanted to tell real quickly, and it's about these two people sitting at a table in a donut shop. And the man, young, well-dressed man in a business suit, is on his mad dash to work, but he goes up and he gets a coffee and a bag of donut holes. We all love those, they're delicious. So he sits down at the table, and across from him sits a man who's not as well dressed, very shabbily dressed, very relaxed, wild hair, if you will, so you can picture it in your mind's eye, and he sits across from him, and they're sitting there, and they're both reading. One is reading the paper, the other one's reading a book. And the man that's well dressed, we're going to listen to this scenario from his perspective. As he's sitting there, he notices that the man sitting across from him reaches into the bag of donuts and takes a donut hole and pops it into his mouth. And he's thinking to himself, who is this guy eating my donut holes? That's kind of crazy, but hey, you know, there's a bunch of them in there, no big deal. So he goes on reading, he grabs a donut hole, he pops it into his mouth, sips his coffee. Then a couple minutes later, a guy reaches over, grabs another donut hole, pops it into his mouth. The guy is like, this is really weird. And he's like, he must be really hungry. It's kind of rude. He didn't even ask. And he looks at the guy, and he smiles, and the guy smiles back at him. So he really doesn't know what to say. But he's like, wow, I just don't know what to do with this guy. I don't know whether to move the bag or I'm just going to go on reading my paper. I'm sure he's going to move off to someplace else in a little while. I can smell him from here. And so he's looking through his paper, and the guy reaches over and gets another donut hole and pops it in his mouth. And the guy's like, I just can't believe this. This is the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me. And he looks into the bag, and there's one donut hole left. And so he leaves it there, and the guy who's sitting across from him reaches into the bag and grabs that last donut hole and pops it into his mouth. This guy's looking at him. Who does he think he is, eating my last donut hole? It's not like he didn't eat most of them anyway. This is crazy. And he gets really mad, and he gets up, and as he gets up, his bag of donut holes falls off of his lap. And so he's been eating this other guy's donut holes, who never said a word to him, but he's getting all worked up over the donut holes. So I think it's a perfect example of how we assume something. You know, if we don't have all the facts, we're not really in control of the situation. Instead of saying, hey, are those your donut holes, or are those my donut holes? Simple thing to ask. Why would he be offended by that? But in my mind, I'm thinking, yeah, no, I shouldn't say anything because he might be violent. He looks homeless. I don't know what's going on there. Really, it's just crazy the way that our brains work. And it's so disrespectful not to give somebody the opportunity to express themselves, right? Yeah. Yes, Magda.
Felix Unger said it best in one of his shows.
The Odd Couple?
The Odd Couple. He broke it down assumption. When you make an assumption, you make an answer.
And that's right. And I think we all know that little saying. But why that is the case, I think that sometimes that eluded us when we were kids, and we would say that. So it should not elude us any longer. So I thought I'd share that with you next time you're in a situation and you start having that internal conversation. Open your mouth. Use your words. They're powerful and can change the reality of a situation very quickly if you're not making assumptions. I'm going to invite Reverend Max now to the podium, and he's going to lead us in meditation. Reverend Max, do you want music?
Yes, but wait a second. Yeah, one of the great assumptions in the world is sometimes we think we're meditating when we're not. So fundamentally, meditation is to get your brain to produce alpha waves, or delta waves, or theta waves, in some cases with the advanced people. So what we're gonna do tonight is do a biofeedback response meditation, which means you can help your brain produce alpha waves anywhere, anytime for relaxation, for reviewing and being reflective in your mind to accomplish the daily tasks you need to. Because when we're stressed, it's kind of hard to be reflective. Okay, so we're gonna take 3 breaths. I want you to keep your eyes open for the first 2. At the end of the 3rd one, we'll close our eyes. Because visual cues often disrupt. Now, there are some Asian techniques where the eye is open but unfocused. And that's because you're gonna get your eye to work in reverse. So you can see data, and also you can produce data outward. So when you see somebody with open eye meditation, their reality is not this one, they're someplace else. Okay, so let's sit straight up to give the spine access to being in its best position. Let's put our feet flat on the ground. There you go. Let's take one deep breath, fill your lungs. When they're full, stop for a second, and then let them go out through pursed lips. Want to be able to use all available oxygen. Second breath. In. Stop. Out. Third one. Stop. Out. Let your eyes close. Now continue to breathe